Interview with a Vampire. Acquired archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in, let the outside world dissolve and gently descend into tonight's world. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of an old European city, in a mansion that time itself seems to have abandoned, I was invited to speak with someone who has watched centuries pass like seasons. Someone who remembers the fall of empires, the birth of nations, and the countless quiet moments in between, where human lives flickered like candles, brief and beautiful, against the endless dark. This is an interview with a vampire. Chapter 1. The House That Breathes. The invitation arrived on paper so old it crumbled at the edges, written in ink that might once have been red, but had faded to the colour of dried roses. The handwriting was elegant in a way that no one writes anymore. Each letter formed with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, which, as I would come to learn, they did. The address led me through cobblestone streets that grew narrower with each turn, until the modern world felt like a dream I was slowly forgetting. Street lamps became fewer, then disappeared entirely, replaced by shadows that seemed to have weight and texture. The sounds of the city faded behind me, car horns and distant music giving way to silence so complete it felt like a presence. I passed through squares I did not recognize, though I had lived in this city for years, past fountains that no longer ran, their basins filled with leaves that might have been collecting for decades, past shop windows that displayed merchandise from another era, mannequins in clothes that would have been fashionable before my grandparents were born. Everything felt slightly wrong, slightly displaced from the reality I knew. The house appeared between two others, though I could have sworn the gap had been empty a moment before. It was tall and narrow, built in a style that belonged to no particular era, as if it had been constructed from memories rather than stone. The facade was dark with age, streaked with patterns that might have been water damage or might have been something else, something that had been seeping out from inside for centuries. The windows were dark, but not empty. I could feel something watching from behind the glass, patient and curious. The sensation was not entirely unpleasant, more like being observed by an old painting that had somehow developed awareness, interested in what I might do next, waiting to see if I would have the courage to approach. I stood at the gate for what felt like hours, though my watch showed only seconds passing. The iron was cold under my fingers, colder than the night air could explain, and it seemed to hum with a frequency just below hearing, as if the metal itself was alive, as if it was deciding whether to let me pass. The door opened before I could knock, swinging inward on hinges that made no sound. The hallway beyond was lit by candles that burned with flames that did not flicker, as if the air itself was too still, too ancient, to disturb them. The light they cast was golden, but somehow thin, as if it was tired, as if even light could grow weary after burning in the same place for too long. I stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature change, not warmer or colder, but different, as if the air belonged to another time entirely. It smelled of old paper and candle wax and something underneath, something organic and ancient, like the air in a forest that has never been touched by human feet, or the air in a tomb that has been sealed since the pharaohs ruled. I walked through rooms filled with furniture draped in white cloth, like sleeping ghosts waiting to be awakened. Each room seemed larger than the last, expanding in ways that defied the narrow exterior of the house. Ceilings rose beyond the reach of the candlelight, lost in shadows that moved with a life of their own. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow me, their expressions frozen somewhere between sorrow and knowing, as if they understood something about my future that I did not. Some were clearly very old, cracked with age and darkened by time, while others seemed almost fresh, as if they had been painted yesterday, though the style and clothing suggested centuries. I wondered who they were, these watching faces, whether they had been friends or family, or something else entirely, whether they had come to this house as I had, drawn by invitation or curiosity or something they could not name, whether they had left or whether they had never left at all. At the end of a long corridor, I found a door that was already open, and beyond it, a library that seemed to stretch further than the house could possibly contain. Books rose from floor to ceiling, their spines marked in languages I recognized and many I did not. The shelves curved away into shadow, suggesting depth that went on forever, as if I had stepped into a space that existed outside normal geometry. The smell here was stronger, old paper and leather and dust, but also something else, something that made me think of autumn leaves and underground rivers and the particular silence of very late nights. It was not unpleasant, but it was unsettling, as if my body understood something my mind had not yet grasped. And there, in a chair beside a fire that burned without wood, sat the one I had come to meet. They did not look ancient. That was the first surprise. Their face was smooth, ageless in a way that was almost unsettling, as if someone had forgotten to let time touch them. The features were refined, elegant in a way that transcended gender or era, beautiful in the way that marble statues are beautiful, perfect and somehow cold. But their eyes, those eyes held depths that made me understand I was looking at something very, very old. They were dark, not brown or black, but something else. A color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And within that darkness, I could see something moving. Memories, perhaps, or something else. Something that had been watching the world since before my ancestors' ancestors were born. You came, they said, and their voice was like music played in an empty cathedral, beautiful and echoing with loneliness. There were harmonics in it that human voices cannot produce, undertones and overtones that resonated in my chest, in my bones, in places I had not known could hear. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the room itself was speaking, as if the walls and books and shadows all shared the same voice. I wondered if you would. Most turn back before they reach the door. Something in them knows, even if their minds do not, that once you enter this house, you carry a piece of it with you forever. The threshold is a boundary not just in space, but in the soul. Those who cross it are never quite the same. They studied me as they spoke, and I felt the weight of that observation, the accumulated knowledge of centuries being applied to the simple puzzle of my presence. They had seen thousands of faces, perhaps millions, and yet they looked at mine as if it was worth seeing, as if even after all this time, human faces still held some mystery worth exploring. I have waited a long time for someone to listen, truly listen, not with fear clouding their perception, not with greed darkening their heart, but with simple curiosity, simple willingness to hear what I have never been able to say. I asked them where I should sit, and they smiled, a small curve of the lips that held no cruelty, only a kind of tired amusement, as if they had answered this question 1,000 times before, as if they would answer it 1,000 times again. Anywhere you like. There is no protocol here, no ceremony. I have lived long enough to find such things exhausting. The rituals that humans cling to, the rules of etiquette and propriety, they seem so important when you have only decades to live, but centuries have a way of wearing away such concerns, like water wearing away stone. They gestured vaguely toward the room. Please, make yourself comfortable. If comfort is possible in a place like this. This house has not known comfort in a very long time, but it remembers the concept, and sometimes that is enough. I chose a chair across from them, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to feel like I could still leave. Though I suspect that was an illusion they allowed me to maintain. A courtesy extended to the fragile human who had wandered into their domain. You have questions, they said. Everyone who comes here has questions. They want to know about the blood, about the killing, about the hunger. They expect monsters and nightmares. They want me to bare my fangs and confirm their fears, to be the creature from their stories. They paused, their eyes drifting to the fire that cast no shadows, flames dancing without heat, without fuel, sustained by something other than physics. But the truth is far more tedious and far more sad. The truth is about time and what it does to a soul that cannot escape it. The truth is about watching and remembering and continuing when everything you know has turned to dust. The horror is not in the hunger, it is in the endurance. Chapter 2, the weight of centuries. The first century is the hardest, they began, their voice settling into a rhythm like waves against ancient stone. Not because of the hunger, though that is terrible enough, but because you are still human enough to feel loss. You watch everyone you knew grow old and die, while you remain unchanged. A statue in a garden where all the flowers wilt. They rose from their chair and moved to the window, their movements so fluid they seemed to glide rather than walk, as if the rules of motion that governed my body did not quite apply to theirs. There was something almost hypnotic in the way they moved, a grace that came from centuries of practice, or perhaps from something older, something that was never quite human to begin with. Outside, the night pressed against the glass like a living thing. I could see nothing through the window but darkness, not even the lights of the city that should have been there, just an absence of light that seemed to have depth and texture, as if the night itself had gathered to listen to our conversation. I remember the first friend I outlived. We had grown up together, played in the same streets, dreamed the same dreams of adventure and fortune. His name was Marcus, and he was the bravest person I had ever known. The kind of boy who would climb the highest tree, swim the deepest river, challenge any bully who threatened the younger children. They placed one hand against the glass, and I wondered if they could feel the cold, or if such sensations had ceased to have meaning long ago. By the time he was an old man, bent and grey. I still looked as I had the day we met. He did not recognize me at the end. His eyes had grown too dim to see clearly. His mind had begun to wander through years that existed only in memory. But I sat with him, held his hand as he passed, and felt something inside me break that has never fully healed. They turned back to face me, and their expression was difficult to read, somewhere between peace and devastation, as if they had made a kind of truce with their grief, but had never stopped carrying it. I stayed with his family for as long as I could, watched his children grow, then his grandchildren. But eventually they began to notice, to whisper about the strange family friend who never aged, who only visited at night, who looked at old paintings with recognition that should have been impossible. I had to leave before the suspicions grew too dangerous. They returned to their chair, but did not sit, instead standing behind it, using it as a barrier between us, or perhaps as support. After the first few decades, you learn to keep your distance. You watch from the edges of society, moving from place to place before anyone notices that you do not age. You become a ghost long before you stop breathing, haunting the world without truly being part of it. I asked about the practical aspects, how one maintains an existence across centuries, how one avoids the authorities, the curious, the hunters who must surely exist. Carefully, very carefully, you learn to forge documents, to create identities that can be discarded when necessary. In the old days, it was easier. Records were poor. People rarely traveled far from where they were born. A stranger was always a stranger, and strangers were expected to have mysteries. They began to pace, slow measured steps that seemed to count out the passing of time. Now it is harder. Your world is full of cameras and databases and interconnected systems that track every movement. I have had to become a kind of artist of absence, learning to exist in the gaps between your surveillance, to be present without being recorded, to walk through your world without leaving footprints. I asked about the historical events they had witnessed, the great moments that shaped the world. Ah, you want stories of battles and revolutions, of kings and emperors. They smiled, but it did not reach their eyes. I have seen all of those. I watched Rome fade from power, not with a bang, but with a slow exhale, like a patient too tired to keep fighting. The empire did not fall in a day. It crumbled over generations, each one a little weaker than the last, until one morning, the legions simply were not there anymore. They moved to a bookshelf, pulling a volume that looked older than any book I had ever seen, handling it with a tenderness that spoke of memories beyond its pages. I saw the plague sweep through cities, leaving streets silent except for the sound of crows. Entire neighborhoods emptied in a matter of days. The survivors walked like ghosts among the dead, their eyes hollow with a grief that no mind could fully contain. I helped where I could, carried bodies when the living were too weak, held the hands of the dying when no one else would come near. They replaced the book, their fingers lingering on its spine. I watched humans burn each other over differences in faith, convinced that their cruelty was righteousness. I saw the Inquisition at its worst, the witch trials that swept through village after village. I learned very quickly to hide what I was, because the flames that consumed the accused would have been nothing compared to what they would do to something like me. They returned to their chair, settling into it as if the weight of memory made them heavy, as if each recollection added another stone to a burden they had been carrying for longer than I could comprehend. But those are not the moments I remember most clearly. The grand events blur together after a while. What stays sharp, what I cannot forget no matter how I try, are the small moments. A child laughing in a market square, the sound bright and pure against the backdrop of a world that was often cruel, a young couple kissing in the shadow of a cathedral, their love brief and burning and beautiful. Their hands moved as they spoke, elegant gestures that seemed to draw pictures in the air, as if they were painting the memories for me to see. An old woman feeding pigeons in a park that has since been paved over. She came every morning for 30 years, naming each bird, talking to them as if they understood, and perhaps they did. Perhaps there is a kind of understanding that transcends language, a knowing that exists in the simple act of being present, of showing up, of continuing when continuing seems impossible. I waited, sensing there was more. I remember a baker in Florence who made the most extraordinary bread. His name was Giovanni, and he worked before dawn every day for 40 years. I would sometimes stand outside his shop in the darkness, watching the light from his ovens paint the street gold, smelling the yeast and flour and something magical that I could never quite identify. They looked at me with eyes that held centuries of watching. He never knew I was there, never knew that a creature of the night found peace in the rhythm of his simple work. But I watched him grow from young man to old, watched his children take over the ovens, watched the shop close eventually when the family line ended. And I still remember the exact color of that light, the exact smell of that bread, more clearly than I remember empires rising and falling. I asked if they ever felt tempted to reveal themselves, to share their burden with someone. Of course, the loneliness is considerable. There have been times when I thought I would go mad from it, when I wanted nothing more than to tell someone the truth, to have one person in the world who knew me, who understood what I carried, who could look at me and see not a monster, not a mystery, but simply someone who was very tired and very alone. They were silent for a long moment, and in that silence, I heard the house around us creaking and settling, as if it too was listening, as if the walls themselves were curious what they would say next. But such confessions never end well. Either they do not believe you, and you are left more alone than before, trapped between a truth you cannot prove and a lie you cannot maintain, or they do believe, and then comes the fear, the suspicion, the inevitable betrayal. Humans cannot help themselves. They fear what they do not understand, and they destroy what they fear. Their voice grew softer, almost tender, as if they were speaking of wounds that still had not healed. So, I learned to keep my own counsel, to be content with watching, with remembering, with being a witness to history that no one else will ever know. I have become a library of moments that exist nowhere except in my mind, a museum of the lost and forgotten. And sometimes I wonder if that is purpose enough, if simply remembering can justify an existence that seems to have no other meaning. They paused, and in that pause, I sensed something shifting, as if they were deciding whether to continue, whether to venture into territory they had not explored in a very long time. There are nights when the weight of all those memories becomes almost unbearable. When I can feel every face, every voice, every moment I have ever witnessed, pressing against the walls of my consciousness, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be mourned. And I wonder if this is what will eventually destroy me, not sunlight or silver or fire, but simply the accumulated mass of everything I cannot forget. They looked at me with eyes that held depths I could not fathom. You asked about loneliness, but loneliness is too simple a word for what I experience. It is more like existence in a different dimension, a dimension where time moves differently, where connections are impossible because they require a shared understanding of mortality. You cannot truly know someone until you face the same ending, and I face no ending. So I can truly know no one. Chapter 3. The Nature of Hunger. You want to know about the hunger, they said, reading my thoughts before I could form the question. Everyone does. It is the part that frightens you, the part that makes you check the shadows on your way home, the part that turns your childhood nightmares into something you fear might be real. They leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw something predatory in their posture, a reminder that for all their eloquence, they were not human. The change was subtle, a shift in the way they held themselves, a sharpening of attention that made me suddenly aware of my own heartbeat, of the blood moving through my veins, of how fragile I truly was in this place. I will not lie to you and say there is no hunger. It is constant, like a sound you cannot stop hearing, like an itch beneath your skin that never fully goes away. In the beginning, I thought it would drive me mad. Every human I passed was a temptation. Every heartbeat was a drum calling me towards something I did not want to become. They folded their hands in their lap, a gesture that might have been prayer in another creature, or might have been an attempt to keep those hands from doing something they would regret. The hunger is not like human hunger. It is not a void that needs to be filled. It is more like a presence, something that lives alongside you, something that whispers in the quiet moments, that urges and suggests and promises. It knows what you need, even when you try to deny it, and it never stops reminding you. I asked what it felt like to experience that hunger firsthand. Imagine the worst thirst you have ever known. Now imagine that thirst does not fade with time, does not diminish with distraction, does not respond to any other liquid. Imagine that thirst becomes a voice, becomes a need that colors every thought, every interaction, every moment of your existence. They stood again, restless in a way I had not seen before, as if the topic itself stirred something they preferred to keep dormant. When I am hungry, truly hungry, humans cease to be individuals. They become heartbeats, pulses of warmth in a cold world. I can hear the blood moving through their bodies, can sense the rhythm of their lives. It takes every ounce of will I have accumulated over centuries to remember that each of those heartbeats is a person, with a name, with a story, with people who would grieve if they were gone. They moved to the fire, though they did not seem to be seeking warmth. But hunger is not unique to my kind. Humans hunger too, for food, for love, for power, for meaning. The difference is that our hunger is more honest, more direct. We know exactly what we need, even if obtaining it comes at a terrible cost. There is no ambiguity, no confusion, no pretending that we want something other than what we want. I asked how they had learned to manage it, to exist in the world without leaving a trail of victims. Time and discipline, the same way any creature masters its baser impulses. In my youth, I was not so controlled. I made mistakes. I hurt people. I carry those sins with me still, carved into my consciousness like inscriptions on a tomb, faces that visit me in the quiet hours, names I cannot forget no matter how I try. They rose again and moved to a bookshelf, running their fingers along the spines of volumes so old they seemed held together by will alone, as if the books themselves had decided not to crumble, had chosen to endure out of sheer stubbornness. But I found that there are ways to survive without destruction. Blood can be taken without killing. People forget. They rationalize. They convince themselves they had a strange dream or a moment of dizziness. Most never know the truth, and I tell myself this makes it acceptable. Though I am not certain that is true. Their hand paused on a particular book, their expression distant, as if they were seeing something other than the library around us. There was a time, perhaps 200 years ago, when I decided to stop entirely, to see if I could starve the hunger into submission. I locked myself away in a house not unlike this one, refused all sustenance, believed I could will myself into something closer to human, something that did not need what I needed. They pulled the book from the shelf, but did not open it, holding it like a talisman, like a relic of a battle that had been fought and lost. It did not work. The hunger does not diminish. It grows. It becomes all-consuming. After several months, I lost myself entirely. I became the very monster I was trying to escape. When I finally gave in, when I finally fed, I could not stop. The aftermath, I cannot speak of it even now. Centuries later, the guilt sits in my chest like a stone I cannot dislodge. They replaced the book and turned to face me, their expression solemn, their eyes holding something that might have been warning or might have been confession. So I make my peace with what I am. I take what I need as gently as I can, and I try to give something back. I have funded hospitals, supported artists, helped those in need when I could do so without revealing myself. It is not redemption. Nothing could truly balance the scales, but it is something, a way to face the dawn, figuratively speaking, without despair. They returned to their chair, and when they spoke again, their voice was steadier, as if they had moved past the most difficult part of the confession. I have found that the hunger can be directed, shaped, made to serve purposes other than destruction. When I must feed, I choose those who will not be missed, or those whose absence might be a blessing to the world. I have ended tyrants in their beds, stopped monsters who wore human faces. I do not claim righteousness, but I try to ensure that my existence is not entirely without benefit. I asked if that was enough, if such justifications brought any peace. No, not really, but it is better than the alternative, better than surrendering to the hunger completely, better than becoming what the stories say I am. I cling to what humanity remains in me, and hope that it is enough to keep the darkness at bay, to keep me from becoming something that I could not bear to be. Chapter 4. Love in the Dark. I see you wondering, they said. settling back into their chair with a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the body. Whether I have ever loved, whether creatures like me are capable of such things, whether the heart can continue to feel when it no longer beats. I admitted that the question had crossed my mind, that it seemed perhaps too intimate to ask, but that I could not help wondering. Of course it has. Love is the great preoccupation of your species. You write songs about it, fight wars over it, structure your entire lives around its pursuit. You seek it in every face, every touch, every moment of connection, as if love alone could give meaning to the brief flame of your existence. They smiled, and this time there was warmth in it, genuine and unexpected, like sunlight breaking through clouds on a winter day. And yes, I have loved many times, too many times. Perhaps that is the cruelest part of this existence. The capacity for love does not fade with time, does not diminish with loss. Each time feels as real and as overwhelming as the first, and each ending cuts just as deep. They stared into the fire, their face illuminated by flames that seemed to burn from somewhere other than the physical world. Flames that cast no shadows, that gave no heat, that existed purely for the comfort of light in darkness. The first was before I was changed. A woman with hair like autumn leaves and a laugh that could fill a room. Her name was Elena, and she was everything I thought I wanted. Kind and clever and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her features. Beautiful in the way she moved through the world, as if every moment was a gift she was grateful to receive. Their voice grew quiet, barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb memories that had been sleeping for centuries. We were young and certain, the way only the young can be, that our love would last forever. We made promises under stars that are now dead, whispered futures that would never come to pass. I told her I would love her until the end of time, and I meant it. I meant it with every fiber of my being, not knowing that time would take on a very different meaning for me. They fell silent, and I did not push. Some griefs are too deep for questions, too ancient for words. I do not know what happened to her. After my change, I could not return. I was too dangerous, too unpredictable. The hunger was new and overwhelming, and I knew that if I went back to her, if I held her in my arms again, I might not be able to stop myself from doing something unforgivable. They shifted in their chair, as if the memory itself was uncomfortable, as if it had edges that still cut after all this time. By the time I had learned control, decades had passed. She would have been old or gone. I never found out which. I could not bear to know, could not bear to see her withered by time while I remained unchanged, could not bear to learn that she had moved on, had loved another, had lived a life that did not include me. They turned to look at me, their eyes bright with something that might have been tears, though I was not certain such creatures could cry, was not certain if the ducts that produced tears could still function in a body that had ceased to be entirely alive. Since then, there have been others, brief connections, moments of intimacy stolen from eternity. A poet in the 16th century who wrote verses about a mysterious love he could never name. His words were published after his death, and I have a first edition somewhere in this library, pages I cannot bear to read because they are too beautiful, too true. They rose and moved to a window that looked out on the same impenetrable darkness. A doctor in the 19th century who thought she could cure me. She was brilliant and determined and absolutely certain that science could explain anything. She studied me with a passion that bordered on obsession, taking samples, running experiments, trying to understand how I existed when every law of biology said I should not. A soft laugh escaped them, tinged with sadness. She never did find an answer, but in the process of searching, we fell in love, or something like love. She saw me as a puzzle to be solved, and I saw her as a bridge back to the humanity I had lost. We were both wrong, but we were wrong together, and there was comfort in that. They pressed one hand against the glass, and I wondered if they were trying to feel the cold, or trying to feel anything at all. A musician in the 20th century who played symphonies in empty concert halls while I listened from the shadows. He knew I was there, could sense my presence somehow, and he played for me, just for me, pieces that no audience would ever hear, music that existed only in that moment, in the space between his hands and my ears. They turned to look at me with eyes that seemed to hold entire lifetimes of longing. But each connection ends the same way. They grow old. I remain. They sense something wrong, something I cannot explain, something that makes them uncomfortable in ways they cannot articulate. And eventually, they are gone, whether by death or by choice. And I am alone again, and the silence is louder than before. I asked if they had ever considered changing someone, creating a companion who could walk through eternity with them. Their reaction was immediate, a sharpness entering their voice that had not been there before, a coldness that reminded me suddenly that I was sitting across from a predator. Never. I would never curse another soul with this existence. To do so would be the greatest cruelty I could imagine. The loneliness is terrible, but it is nothing compared to the guilt of knowing you condemned someone else to share it. That you looked at someone you loved and decided that your need for company outweighed their right to a natural life. They stood abruptly, pacing the room with agitated energy. Their movements no longer fluid, but sharp, jagged, as if something had broken their composure. I have seen others of my kind, those who create companions out of desperation, out of loneliness so profound they cannot bear it alone. And I have seen what happens. The resentment that builds over decades, the blame, the hatred. Two creatures bound together by an act of violence, trying to love while the very nature of their existence tears them apart. They stopped by the window again, their reflection barely visible in the dark glass. A ghost looking at a ghost. The one who is changed always comes to hate the one who changed them. It may take years, decades, centuries, but it always happens. The gratitude fades, the love sours, and what remains is only the knowledge that someone who claimed to care for you stole your death, stole your ending, trapped you in an existence you never chose. They placed both hands on the glass now, as if pushing against the darkness outside. No, I will face eternity alone. That is my burden to carry, mine alone. I will not inflict it on another, no matter how much I might long for someone to understand, to truly understand what it means to watch the world change while you remain the same, to love and lose and love again, knowing that the losing never stops, never ends, just goes on and on until the stars burn out. Chapter 5. The Long Memory. You asked earlier about historical events, they said, returning to their chair with a composure that suggested the moment of agitation had passed. The walls rebuilt around whatever had briefly broken through. Let me tell you what I truly remember. Not the battles or the treaties, but the texture of the past, the things your history books cannot capture. They settled deeper into the cushions, and their voice took on a quality like someone reciting a dream, soft and distant and somehow more real than the room around us. I remember when the nights were truly dark, before electric lights turned your cities into perpetual twilight. There was a time when darkness meant something, when stepping outside after sunset was entering another world, a world of shadows and possibility, of danger and wonder, when the night was a place unto itself, not just the absence of day. They gestured toward the window where the impenetrable darkness still pressed against the glass. People walked differently then, moved through the dark with caution and respect. They carried lanterns that cast small circles of light, islands of vision in an ocean of black. And beyond those circles, anything could exist, anything at all. The night was full of stories because no one could see what was really there. I tried to imagine it, a world without streetlights, without glowing screens, without the constant ambient illumination that we take for granted. Now the sky is orange with pollution and light. The stars are dim suggestions of what they once were. I remember when the Milky Way was a river of light across the heavens, so bright you could almost read by it, so beautiful it made you understand why ancient peoples thought the gods lived in the sky. They shook their heads slowly, as if grieving something they could never get back. Children today will never know what it was like to look up and see the universe sprawled above them, infinite and humbling. They will never feel the particular terror and beauty of true darkness. They live in a world that is always lit, always visible, always known. And something has been lost in that knowing. Something magical and terrible and irreplaceable. I asked what else had been lost. Silence. The world was once so quiet. No engines, no electronics, no constant hum of machinery. In the deep country, you could stand in a field and hear nothing but the wind and your own heartbeat, the rustle of grass, the distant call of birds, the creaking of trees, and beneath it all, a silence so profound it was almost a sound itself. They closed their eyes, as if listening for something that was no longer there. I remember the first time I heard an engine, a steam train passing in the distance. I thought it was a dragon, some ancient thing awakening from its long sleep. The sound was so alien, so wrong, that I hid for days, waiting for the monster to pass. It seems foolish now. But you cannot imagine how shocking it was. That mechanical roar in a world that had always been quiet. They opened their eyes again, and there was something almost like grief in them. Now there is nowhere left to escape the noise. Even in the most remote places, aircraft pass overhead, signals travel through the air. The silence is gone, perhaps forever, and with it, a kind of peace that humans no longer know they are missing. A peace that came from being truly alone, truly separate from the chatter of civilization. They shifted, crossing their legs with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, every movement practiced over centuries until it became nature. I remember when travel was an undertaking, when crossing a continent took months, when an ocean voyage was a genuine adventure fraught with uncertainty. You might leave and never return. You might arrive somewhere completely different from what you expected. Every journey was a transformation, because the traveler who returned was never quite the same as the one who left. They smiled, but it was a melancholy expression. Now you can circle the globe in a day, see everything, know everything, but experience nothing. Speed has stolen depth from your world. Convenience has replaced adventure. You arrive at your destination unchanged, unmoved, having seen nothing but the inside of vehicles and terminals. I asked what they missed most about the old ways of travel: the anticipation, the weeks of preparation, the gradual approach, the slow revelation of a new place. I remember the first time I saw Rome, after walking for months from the north. The city appeared gradually, first the distant walls, then the towers, then the streets and buildings and people. Each step brought new details, new wonders. By the time I stood in the Forum, I knew that city in my bones. I had earned the right to see it. They fell quiet for a moment, lost in memory. Now tourists arrive by plane, spend a day taking photographs, and leave without ever truly seeing anything. They collect images instead of experiences. They check boxes on lists instead of letting places change them. Rome is still beautiful, but it is a different kind of beauty now. Faster, shallower, less transformative. Their voice grew more contemplative. I remember when death was intimate, when families washed and dressed their own dead, when grief was visible on city streets, when mortality was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. Death was part of life then, a presence that walked alongside you, that reminded you every day how precious and how brief your time truly was. They looked at me with eyes that had seen more death than I could imagine. Humans have become strangers to their own endings, and I wonder if that is progress or just another form of fear. You hide your dying in institutions. You speak of death in euphemisms. You pretend it is something that happens to other people, somewhere else. And in that pretending, you lose something, a kind of urgency, a kind of appreciation, a kind of wisdom that only comes from living in the presence of death. I asked how someone who could not die truly experienced death. I experience it constantly. Every human I meet will die, most of them within decades. Every face I see is temporary. Every conversation is with someone who is already fading. I live surrounded by the dying, and in that sense, I am more intimate with death than any mortal, because for me, it never stops. It is not an event that happens once. It is a constant process, a never-ending grief. They rose and moved to a bookshelf, their fingers trailing along the spines of ancient volumes. I remember plagues that emptied cities, wars that redrew borders, inventions that reshaped the way humans lived. But I also remember the taste of bread baked in wood-fired ovens, the sound of languages that no one speaks anymore, the feel of clothing woven on looms that have long since rotted to dust. They pulled out a book, opened it to a random page, and stared at writing I could not read from where I sat. I remember faces, thousands upon thousands of faces, people I knew for a moment or a decade, all of them gone now, all of them existing only in my memory. Sometimes I wonder if I am the only proof they ever existed, if my remembering is all that keeps them from fading entirely into the void. They closed the book gently, reverently, as if it contained something sacred. A serving girl in medieval France who laughed at my jokes and brought me wine I could not drink. A blacksmith in Renaissance Italy who forged me a blade I still carry somewhere in this house. A child in Victorian London who called me the night man and was not afraid. I asked if the memories were a burden or a gift. Both, neither. They are simply what I am. A vessel for moments that the world has forgotten. A witness to lives that made no mark on history but were no less meaningful. I carry them all. The beautiful and the terrible. The mundane and the extraordinary. And I will carry them until the end of my existence, whenever that may be. Chapter 6. The endless night. I suspect you are wondering, they said. And now their voice was very tired, weighted with centuries of weariness. How this ends, whether there is an ending at all, whether I will simply continue forever, watching and waiting and remembering. I admitted that the question had haunted me throughout our conversation, that I could not imagine existence without a boundary, without a final punctuation mark to give the sentence meaning. It haunts me too, more than you can imagine. The uncertainty is perhaps the worst part. Humans at least know that death awaits. There is a horizon, a boundary, a point at which the journey ends. You can look ahead and know that whatever happens, it will eventually be over. There is comfort in that, a kind of promise that whatever you suffer, it will not last forever. They looked at their hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time, examining fingers that had touched centuries of history, that had held dying friends and lover alike, that had done things they could not speak of. But for me, there is only the path stretching forward into darkness, no end in sight, no final rest, just more nights, more watching, more remembering, forever and ever and ever. The word forever sounds beautiful in love songs, but when you actually face it, when you truly understand what it means, it becomes the most terrifying thing imaginable. They rose one final time and moved to stand before me, closer than they had been all evening, close enough that I could see the slight imperfections in their skin, the tiny marks that were not wrinkles but something else, something that suggested age beyond my comprehension. I have seen others of my kind meet their ends, some by violence, caught by hunters or mobs or other creatures that prey on us as we prey on humans, some by accident, the sun they thought they had avoided, the fire they did not see coming, the silver blade that found them when their guard was down. They knelt, bringing their face level with mine, and I found I could not look away from those ancient eyes. Some by choice. That is the one that frightens me most. Those who simply decided that enough was enough, that another century was more than they could bear. They walked into the dawn, or found some other method, and ended themselves, not from despair exactly, but from exhaustion, from a weariness so profound that non-existence seemed preferable to another night of the same. Their voice dropped to barely a whisper. It is possible to die, but it is difficult, and the moment has never felt right. There is always something holding me here. Curiosity, perhaps, or cowardice, or simply the habit of existence. After this long, continuing becomes automatic. You do not decide to live each day. You simply fail to decide to stop. They moved to a corner of the library where the shadows were thickest, where even the strange light of the fireless flame could not quite reach. I have stood at the edge of ending more times than I can count, felt the pull of oblivion, the seductive whisper of release. There is a particular peace in the contemplation of non-existence, a stillness that nothing in life can match. To simply stop, to cease, to no longer carry the weight of endless continuity. Their voice seemed to come from the darkness itself, but each time, something has called me back, a curiosity about what might happen next, a desire to see one more century, one more transformation of the world, a fear that perhaps there is nothing beyond this, that the end of my awareness is the end of everything, and that the universe will become somehow less without my witnessing. They stepped back into the light, and their expression was more open than I had seen it all evening. It is vanity, perhaps, to think that my watching matters, but it is the vanity that keeps me here, the belief that someone needs to remember, that someone needs to witness, that the passing of ages cannot go entirely unnoted. They stood again, and the distance between us returned, as if the moment of intimacy had been a gift they were not sure they should have given. I have thought about it many times over the centuries. There have been dawns when I stood at my window, watching the light approach, wondering if I had the courage to let it take me. The sun would be rising, gold and pink and promising, and I would think about how beautiful it would be to see one more sunrise, to feel warmth on my face after so long in the dark. They moved to the window, though there was no approaching dawn there, only the endless night that seemed to surround this house like a shroud. But I have never done it, not because I fear the pain, though I imagine it would be considerable, not because I cling to existence, but because some part of me still believes that there is purpose in my existence, that all this watching, all this remembering means something, that one day, perhaps, I will understand why I was made this way, what I am supposed to learn from eternity. They turned back to face me, and their expression was unlike anything I had seen from them before, vulnerable in a way that seemed almost human. Or perhaps I am simply afraid that there is nothing after, that the end of my existence is just emptiness, no heaven, no hell, no continuation, just the cessation of the only consciousness I have ever known. And I am not ready for that. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Perhaps I will walk through all of eternity because I cannot face the alternative. They reached out, and for a moment, I thought they might touch me, but their hand stopped just short, hovering in the air between us, a bridge that was not quite built. So I continue. I watch your world change. I remember what has been lost. I wait for something I cannot name, and I hope, though hope seems strange in a creature like me, that someday I will find the answer that makes all this time, all this loneliness, all this hunger worth enduring. They stepped back, and the distance between us seemed to grow, not just physically, but in some deeper way, as if they were retreating into a place I could not follow. You should go now. Dawn will come, eventually, even in a house like this, and you have a life to return to, a life with boundaries and meaning, and an ending that gives everything else weight. Do not waste it wondering about creatures like me. Live it fully and fiercely while you still can. I stood and gathered my things, feeling the strangeness of the moment, the weight of everything they had shared, carrying pieces of centuries that did not belong to me. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt inadequate, like trying to hold an ocean in a teacup. They smiled, that same tired, ancient smile that held more wisdom than any book in their endless library. "Thank you for listening. It has been a long time since anyone sat with me through the night, since I spoke these thoughts aloud. You have given me a gift, even if you do not realize it, the gift of being heard, of being known, even if only for a few hours." They opened the door, and the hallway beyond seemed different now, the candles brighter, the shadows less threatening, as if the house itself had warmed to my presence, or had simply grown tired of trying to frighten me. "Remember me," they said, their voice following me down the corridor, like a whisper carried on wind that did not exist. "Remember what I have told you, and when you see the night sky, think of me, watching from somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the stars to reveal their secrets, patient as only the truly old can be." I walked through the corridor of sleeping furniture, past the portraits with their knowing eyes. Each face seemed to nod as I passed, acknowledging my departure, wishing me well in whatever way paintings could wish. The candles that lined the hall flickered now, as if the stillness that had held them steady was finally releasing its grip. The door opened before I reached it, and the night air that rushed in was shockingly ordinary, filled with the distant sounds of traffic, the smell of rain on pavement, all the mundane sensations of the world I had briefly left behind. I stepped across the threshold, felt something shift inside me, as if a door was closing that could never be opened again. And when I turned to look back, the house was gone, just an empty space between two buildings, as if it had never been there at all, as if I had dreamed the entire encounter, except that I knew I had not, knew it with a certainty that went deeper than memory. But I remember every word, every shadow, every moment in that library that seemed to contain all the lost hours of history. And sometimes, in the deep watches of the night, I feel eyes on me, patient and curious, and I wonder if they are still watching, still waiting, still hoping for an answer to a question that has no end. The city resumed around me, cars passing, people walking, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. I had sat with eternity, had heard its voice, had glimpsed for just a moment what it might be like to live without boundaries, to love without end, to remember without forgetting. And as I walked home through streets that were suddenly too bright, too loud, too full of people who had never thought about what forever really meant, I understood something that I had not understood before, that every ending is a gift, that every limit is a kindness, that the frame around a picture is what makes it art, and the death at the end of a life is what makes it precious. The vampire had given me something that no mortal could give, a new appreciation for the walls around my existence, a gratitude for the boundaries I had never thought to thank, and perhaps, in their own way, that was why they continued, not for themselves, but for those like me who needed to be reminded that even the darkness can be a teacher, and even the endless night can illuminate truths that the day would never reveal. In the days that followed, I found myself changed in ways I could not quite articulate. I noticed the sunlight more, the way it fell through windows, the warmth of it on my skin. I thought about how the vampire could not feel that warmth, had not felt it for centuries, and I understood it as a gift I had taken for granted. I watched people on the street with new eyes, seeing not just faces, but entire lives, brief stories moving through space and time. Each person carried their own history, their own sorrows and joys, and none of them would last. None of them would stand unchanged while the world transformed around them. And I understood now that this was mercy, not tragedy. I thought about the vampire's loneliness, that vast and terrible isolation that stretched across centuries, and I felt something like compassion, but also something like gratitude. Gratitude that I would never know that particular emptiness, that I would live and love and eventually fade, like everyone I had ever known, like everyone I would ever meet. Sometimes, late at night, when the city grew quiet and the darkness pressed against my windows, I would think I heard something, a whisper carried on no wind, a presence at the edge of perception, and I would wonder if the vampire was thinking of me too, wondering how my brief life was unfolding, remembering our conversation with the same clarity they remembered everything else. The months passed, as months do, each one bringing its small changes, its tiny erosions. I grew a little older, a little wiser, a little closer to the ending that awaited me. And instead of fearing it, I welcomed those changes, welcomed the grey hairs that began to appear, the slight stiffness in my joints, the gathering weight of years that proved I was still moving, still changing, still alive in the way that only mortal things can be. I never went back to that street, never looked for the house that breathed. Part of me was afraid it would be there, waiting, and part of me was afraid it would not, that it had been a dream, or a vision, or something else entirely, something that existed only in the space between midnight and dawn. But I kept my promise. I remembered every night when I looked at the sky, when I saw the pale suggestion of stars through the city's glow, I thought of that ancient creature, sitting in their eternal library, surrounded by the memories of 1,000 lifetimes, waiting for an answer that might never come. And in my own small way, I became a keeper of their story, a vessel for truths that the vampire had shared with me alone. I carried their loneliness in my heart, their hunger and their hope, their love and their loss. And I understood that this too was a kind of immortality, this passing of stories from one soul to another, this chain of remembrance that stretched back through time and forward into futures none of us would see. The night I met the vampire, I learned that eternity is not a gift. It is a weight, a burden, a sentence with no punctuation. But I also learned that the brevity of human life is not a curse. It is what makes every moment matter, what makes every choice significant, what makes every love a miracle against impossible odds. We are all dying from the moment we are born. And that dying is what makes us beautiful, what makes us precious, what makes us worthy of the attention of creatures who will outlast the stars. So live, as I have tried to live since that night, fully and fiercely and without apology. Love deeply, even knowing it will end. Create boldly, even knowing it will be forgotten. Reach out to others, even knowing they will leave. Because the alternative, that endless night, that infinite watching, that eternal hunger without hope of satisfaction, is not life at all. It is merely existence, an existence without boundaries, without endings, without the sweet shadow of mortality, is just another kind of emptiness, a darkness that goes on forever, with no dawn to give it meaning. I have kept my promise, I have remembered, and now I have shared, and perhaps, somewhere in the darkness, a creature as old as empires is smiling, knowing that their story will continue, passed from voice to voice, from heart to heart, long after I too have faded into memory. That is the gift we mortals can give the immortal, the gift of continuation, the gift of being carried forward, the gift of meaning in a meaningless eternity. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is why they invited me in, why they shared their truth with someone who could never truly understand, because they needed to be remembered, needed to exist in minds other than their own, needed proof that their centuries of watching had not been for nothing. I gave them that, as they gave me the gift of perspective. And in that exchange, something sacred occurred, something that transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal, between the brief candle and the endless night. We connected, two souls from different worlds, two consciousnesses from different orders of time, and for one night, we were not alone, neither of us. And sometimes, that is the most precious thing of all. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,